frozen, windswept expanse in the Arctic, Vladimir Putin's military ambition is on grand display. Painted like a Russian flag, it's called trefoil for its three-cornered structure, a sprawling new military base that can house 150 troops and warplanes.
This is a lot about the projection of Russia's status, right? Russia's status is a great power, first and foremost. Second, the fact that Russia's an Arctic power.
Sweeping in on a massive military transport, the Russian president recently visited the base. Putin made a show of traversing a glacier and hammering at the ice. Russian troops will be living under the harshest of conditions, 18-month deployments where the temperatures can dip well below zero.
These are really bases set up in perhaps some of the most inhospitable, if not the most inhospitable places on Earth. They're so cold that, short of living on another planet with no oxygen, this is one of the most dangerous and hazardous areas to operate.
But Russian forces pride themselves on being able to operate in the most bitter cold conditions, even training with reindeer. Much of the base is top secret, but the Russian military does boast a virtual tour of some parts of the interior. This is part of Putin's plan to dominate the Arctic. The oil and gas reserves he has his eye on in the Arctic are massive, experts say, worth possibly tens of trillions of dollars, expected to become more accessible if global warming continues.
And they, in some respects, believe that in the future there'll be a contest between powers for who gets access to them. There'll be a lot of economic, commercial competition. And the Russian view is this is a very difficult area to operate. It's going to take a long time for them to establish themselves there, so they want to get theirs first.
Putin is aggressively navigating the region, even having a Russian flag planted on the Arctic Ocean floor. Russia has far more Arctic military bases than the U.S. and dozens more icebreaking ships, perhaps as many as 40.
And how many icebreakers do we have available?
I believe it's one.
1.5.
Okay, 1.5.
Russia's race ahead of the U.S. in cornering the Arctic, analysts say, is a sobering illustration of Putin's broader ambitions.
For Vladimir Putin, the Arctic is a prestige project. It demonstrates Russian history and its greatness. Russia can conquer anything. It can plant a flag on the North Pole. It can build a military installation. It can overcome nature.
Russia's next land grab could be in Europe. Here's what Putin might have his eyes on. Russian President Vladimir Putin has used action abroad to shore up his standing at home. Recent polls indicate his popularity among Russians is falling. That may mean Moscow may soon act against another European country, argues Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia. Not many observers would consider the world's coldest shipping lane a geopolitical hotspot. But that may be about to change. Last week, reports emerged that a new Kremlin policy will require all international naval ships to give Russia 45 days notice before entering the Northern Sea route, which connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans via the Arctic waters north of Siberia. Every vessel on the route, where Russia has invested heavily in sophisticated military infrastructure, will also be required to have a Russian maritime pilot on board. Ships found in violation of these restrictions may be forcibly halted, detained, or, in unspecified extreme circumstances, eliminated. The Kremlin's latest threat has gone largely unnoticed, perhaps because it's no surprise. Russian officials justify the new naval restrictions with a familiar explanation, claiming that the more active naval operations in the Arctic of various foreign countries require such a response. This is the same tactic Russian President Vladimir Putin has used to justify his military adventurism for years, from Georgia in 2008, to Ukraine in 2014, to Syria in 2015. Putin has always laid the blame for Russian aggression squarely at the West's feet. Kremlin-backed media outlets amplify this message, subjecting audiences to a constant deluge of scaremongering about NATO encirclement and pointing to the West's condemnations of Putin's actions as evidence of Russophobia. Many wonder what Putin gains from pushing this narrative. In violating international norms, he has become a global pariah. U.S. and European sanctions have dealt serious blows to Russia's already dismal economy, raising the question of why would Putin pay such a staggering price to carve out a few more pieces of territory. Those who attempt to answer this question miss the point. In Crimea, eastern Ukraine, South Ossetia, or anywhere else Putin considers Russia's backyard, territorial gain has never been an end in itself. Putin's goal today is the same as when he invaded my country in 2008, to tighten his grip on the levers of power in Russia. Whenever Putin's domestic popularity dips, he either escalates an ongoing conflict or launches a new offensive. And, clearly, it works. Putin has ruled the largest country in the world for nearly 2 decades, consolidating more control as he weathers each crisis. Ordinary Russian voters may struggle to survive on pensions of $200 each month, but Putin's base can be proud to live in a superpower. Putin is both predictable and logical. Invading a weaker neighbor delivers a cheaper and faster ratings boost than, say, improving Russia's dystopian healthcare system. It's no coincidence that Putin's approval rating peaked in 2015, after the annexation of Crimea. Later that year, as the Russian economy foundered, the intervention in Syria served to shore up patriotism. Moreover, Russia's actions in Syria marked Putin's graduation from military adventurism in the former Soviet states to power projection beyond Russia's near abroad. To be sure, these steps earned Putin harsh criticism from Washington and Brussels. But condemnation from outside Russia only boosts his popularity within. With every foreign election the Kremlin meddles in, every violation of human rights in occupied Crimea, and every time Russian soldiers moved barbed wire fencing to carve out a few more acres of Georgia's territory, the standard U.S. and European response, a diplomatic expression of deep concern, sounds more like a tired cliché. From the invasion of Georgia to the hybrid offensive in Ukraine, Western leaders have demarcated red line after red line for Putin to trample with impunity. The weakness of international norms, of the rules-based liberal order which many in Washington and Brussels endorse but few dare to defend, makes Moscow look ever stronger. In the eyes of his domestic supporters, Putin is calling the West's bluff. But the status quo cannot hold. If we have learned anything from the past 2 decades, a new crisis is on the horizon. According to a March 7 poll by the Russian Public Opinion Research Center, Russian voters' trust in Putin has fallen to 32%, the lowest level since 2006. True to form, Putin has been escalating provocations in recent months as his popularity has declined. In November, Russian forces fired upon and detained 3 Ukrainian naval ships attempting to pass through the Kerch Strait into the Sea of Azov. More than 100 days have passed, and the outcry from the international community has long since died down. But the 24 Ukrainian sailors arrested during that incident remain in illegal detention. Putin's violations of laws and norms in Russia's backyard no longer seem to shock the world. He has already redrawn the borders of Europe by force and gotten away with it. Now, to provoke the West's ire, he will have to do something even more egregious. It is not a question of whether he will attack, but where. Some point to Belarus, but Putin stands to gain little through a show of force in a country that most Russians already consider an integral part of Russia. Others predict that the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania will be the next target. Putin certainly views the small Baltic countries as a threat. After all, they are functioning democracies on Russia's border. But, for now, the Baltics are probably safe, for 2 reasons. First, the next frontier of Russian aggression is unlikely to be a NATO ally. The inconsistent responses of the West to Moscow's various land grabs have only emboldened Putin, but he is not quite bold enough to risk triggering NATO's Article 5, which could lead to all-out conventional war against a US-led alliance. Putin understands when he is outmatched. If that weren't the case, he would not have survived this long. Second, Putin's next adventure will likely be outside the former Soviet Union. The West has grudgingly accepted his neo-imperialist ambitions in the region. Further incursions into Ukraine, Georgia, or other non-NATO Soviet successor states would be déjà vu all over again, which would do little to bolster Putin's position. I have had the misfortune of getting to know Putin better than most people. Drawing on this first-hand knowledge, I predict a different direction of escalation. Russia's most likely target in the near future is either Finland or Sweden. Although both are members of the EU, they are not members of NATO. By attacking a non-NATO country, Putin does not risk a proportional response in accordance with Article 5. but by targeting a European country, he can expect to reap the rewards of public approval at home from voters who are desperate for a victory. This is a simple cost-benefit analysis that Putin has conducted, openly, many times before. Each investment of Russian force has paid dividends. Finland and Sweden meet both requirements. I do not expect Russian tanks to roll into Helsinki or Stockholm unopposed. But it would be relatively simple for Moscow to execute a land grab in a remote Arctic enclave or on a small island, like Sweden's Gotland, considering the strategic capabilities Russia has built on its northern flank. After all, who would go to war over a frozen Baltic island or piece of Finland's tundra? NATO wouldn't, but Putin would, because the stakes are higher for him. Russian aggression on Scandinavian territory, in countries everyone in the West considers part of the West, might seem far-fetched. However, it was not long ago that Putin's annexation of Crimea, which I predicted, struck even Russia hawks as an outlandish doomsday scenario. A few years earlier Russia's invasion of Georgia, despite my dire warnings, also took the world by surprise. Former Soviet states, even if they are NATO members like Estonia, are widely perceived as not quite Western. This perception may be inaccurate, but in politics, perception often matters more than reality. For Finland and Sweden, though, perception and reality are aligned. They are not ex-Soviet republics, they are unquestionably part of the West. From Georgia to Ukraine, Syria, and beyond, Putin's trajectory has been clear. By defying the norms imposed by the West, he has, in his view, taken progressively greater steps toward emancipating himself. But he will only achieve full emancipation by confronting the West directly. This may sound shocking, but Putin has shocked the world many times over. The West cannot afford to be caught off guard again. Mikhail Saakashvili is a senior statesman at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and was president of Georgia from 2004 to 2013. Read the original article on foreign policy. Real world. Real time. Follow Foreign Policy on Facebook. Subscribe to Foreign Policy here.